the reason why 6v6 felt so good in a lot of ways was both the tank synergy and also like part of that social aspect. You can't just blame one person all the time. Like that is one of the biggest problems of Overwatch, is just genuinely the social impact of people always blame tanks, or like tanks blame support, right? And like both of them can end up being right and wrong at the same time, right? And the reason why 6v6 was better for that was because you always had the other person, right? Like at least they couldn't figure out which tank it was. Like they just argue with both of them. And then typically the two tank players would argue back, right? Like you had a buddy, right? You had a buddy. You weren't in it by yourself, right? That was actually kind of nice because like sometimes you'd have to figure out a new synergy or find out something else, right? The downside though was tanks in a lot of ways dictated the pace of the game and were really like the strongest characters in the game. But the thing is though, is the tanks were dictated by the supports, right? Support is what dictated what tanks you would play. So support arguably was stronger, right? However, though, that they didn't have the most impact in the game. It was just like whatever strong supports would enable the tanks, then you pick those tanks. So most people would look at it and go tank problem, but no, it was actually supports that would enable those tanks, right? That's where the big misconception would come between like really, really high level good players and like a casual player, right? Like they think tank is the problem, but it wasn't the tanks, it was actually the support that enabled those tanks, right? That's why 6v6 felt better. 5v5 feels better because every player has individual impact, right? Like if you play DPS, you have much more kill potential. If you're playing support, you have a lot of kill potential and heal potential. You don't have to sit there and heal bot. In Overwatch 1, sometimes you just sit there and heal bot, right? Like you'd have to just sit there and spam your tanks to keep them alive. You don't always have to do that in Overwatch 2. On the tank role, you're just stronger. You have more HP, you have more damage, you have more killing power at a lot of times. But so does their tank, so it evens out to a point where you're actually not doing anything. But if their tank dies, sometimes you can like win a 1v1 and like the DPS doesn't have a chance. Like a good example is that like D.Va right now. D.Va's really strong, and so like you just walk up to like a cast and you just micro missile him, he'll explode, and there's just nothing he can do, right? Individual impact in 5v5 is on average higher, but there's less synergy. There's easier people to blame. There's more fighting, and a lot of the tanks just weren't balanced or designed for 5v5, and a lot of the tanks that have come out in 5v5 are not designed well. Mauga being the big one, right? They just basically took 2 hero kits and shoved it into one, and he's just a big unkillable meatball. Or he sucks. It's one of the two, right? Roadhog, another, either unkillable meatball or sucks. Or at that one point where he could actually one-shot people with the hook, right? Like you just be like a basically a glass cannon and then run away. Like you would just walk up, pull someone, hook them in, then run away and like try to hope to survive, right? There's some tanks that are well designed, right? Like you have like Queen. Queen I think is well designed. But even like Ramattra, who I think Ramatra's fun. I like Ramattra, but sometimes it just becomes block simulator and you just sit there and you block. And it's not fun to shoot him because you're never gonna kill him and you're sitting there and you're basically just unkillable tanks. Or you're on the opposite side in which you're exploding, right? It's like the two extremes are so wildly different, but both are true at the same time. And tank can be very tank is too difficult to play. Like genuinely for the average player, tank is too difficult to play. You will not play it properly. It takes too much knowledge, it takes too much time, it takes too much investment, and that's why in Overwatch 1, when I was talking about in that part of the video about main tank and off tank, is you would pick a speciality of off tank or main tank, and so off tanks would work more on their mechanics and their enabling abilities, right? Like they would almost work as like a number 2, right? Like you'd always be the number 2 guy. You were the guy that would enable your number 1, and you also put out really good damage with really good mechanics. The number 1 guy was the main tank, and your things were like less mechanical. You didn't have to worry about your mechanics nearly as much, but it was much more macro. Like you'd have to know about ult charge. You'd keep ult charge, rotations, right? Like you would have to be the guy who basically sets the tempo for your team. Like how aggressive are you playing? Are you playing dive aggressive? Are you playing back? Are you playing slow rush? Are you playing corners, right? You were the guy who set the pace of the game for your team. What one tank does is takes both of those roles and smacks into one. And then on top of that, you have now a double pool of characters you have to learn. So it's not just the main tanks you have to learn, it's also the off tanks you have to learn. It's so much put into one, plus all the pressure of always playing meta or always being forced to play meta, right? Which, don't get me wrong, you did in Overwatch 1, you played a lot of meta, but you didn't always have to play the same person, right? And there was also times where, you know, if you had Rein Zarya meta and you have a Hog as your off tank, you maybe can't play Rein because it's just not going to work with the Hog. So you're like, oh well, and you play something else, right? There was also other aspects, but that doesn't work in 5v5 because there's only one person. But 5v5 also brings a lot of good with queue times as well. DPS queue times in Overwatch 1 were like 10 minutes plus. It was awful, and DPS is the most played role by far. And the graph in that dev blog showed that to be true. And it was like, on average, a DPS queue is 7.2 minutes. But in Overwatch 2, it's like 2.3 minutes. You sit there and you go, Flats, you haven't talked about 7v7 yet. Now it's time. The biggest advantage of Overwatch 2 is queue time. DPS is the most played role. And even in Marvel Rivals has the same problem. Nobody wants to play tank. They're open queue though, so they haven't had the problem yet. But nobody wants to play tank. So in Overwatch 2, with one tank, there was much more games being filled up because you'd only need one tank player for every 2 DPS players and 2 support players, because there's a good amount of support players too. DPS is just far and above the best. Because of that, DPS players actually get to play the game. And most casual gamers are probably people who want to just hop in, play a couple games, and hop off. The average gamer does not want to sit in queue for 10 minutes to play one match and then hop off. Also, the majority of Overwatch players are quick play players. If you hop into a quick play game and you get shit stomped, or you shit stomp and it's over in 4 minutes or 5 minutes, congrats. You sat in queue for 10 minutes to then get into a game and then play for 4 minutes. Nobody wants to do that. Especially you're coming home from your 9 to 5 or coming home from school and you have like 2 or 3 hours to play. You don't want to spend half of it in queue. So people don't want to deal with it. So what it's done is it's enabled more people to want to play Overwatch and actually put more time into it. And it's why Overwatch, in my opinion, is a much more casual friendly game. Even though I know during the interview, Aaron disagreed, and that's totally fine. We're allowed to have differences of opinion, even though obviously he's the game director, so he's probably more right than I am. I still stand by what I said. I still feel like it's more casual friendly, which is good for a seasonal modeled game where people can come back and just play the new stuff and then go play Apex and go play Fortnite and go play Valorant, right? And play whatever, like League or CS, whatever free-to-play seasonal models that happen. It's good for the game in that aspect. It keeps people playing, gives it a heartbeat, it's healthy. But the gameplay experience is not good, and it's deteriorating faster and faster and faster and faster. And I would argue that I've seen more people at this point say, and I see one in chat saying it now, more people have said that their friends have quit Overwatch more than ever. And I would argue that the community today, in a lot of ways, resembles old Overwatch, like post-2020 or post-2019, where it was a very hardcore community and there wasn't really new players coming in. I think Overwatch is even that now, where it's a lot more hardcore and it's not gaining new players, it's just losing players. I don't think new people think that they can even jump in. So how do you keep those players happy? How do you keep those people satisfied? How do you give them even a chance to come back? That's where the 6v6 conversation comes in, and being something fresh, something new. But again, I don't think 6v6 is the way either, because it had many problems. So this is how I've come to 7v7. 2 tanks, 3 DPS, 2 supports. Now, when I brought it up to Aaron, he told me that that queue time might only be reduced by 10 or 20%. I thought it would be a little bit more, you know, considering adding an extra role. I know the math isn't totally right, but like rough estimate, 50% slower or faster queue times, because each team has 1 extra DPS player that's getting filled out of the much larger pool. So it's not like, it's not going to be as fast, obviously, as 5v5, but, you know, it's not going to be as long as 6v6. And is a player willing to wait 4 minutes in queue as opposed to 7, almost 8 minutes in queue? I would argue that you have a better chance of getting a player to wait 4 minutes in queue to be at a game if they're willing to wait 2.3, whatever it is right now, right? 2.3 or 2.4, whatever it is. Is it enough that players will still stick around and play? I think there's a good possibility of that. Their argument was that the game was too cluttered. Now, we just watched the past, in which they said, we referenced it and said that they said 6v6 was too cluttered in a lot of ways. There was too much to track, right? I don't think anyone nowadays who's played Overwatch 1 would look back and go, it was too chaotic. I don't think anyone would do that. No one would say that. When originally 6v6 Overwatch, before Overwatch even was a thing, 2015, 2016 was tested, they said 7v7 was too many players. Well, the game's evolved since then. A lot of people have learned the game since then. People have experience, right? Like, if you watch 2016 GM top level gameplay, it looks like a gold, silver player today, right? Like, they look like shit. They look terrible. But at that time, they were the GOATs, right? Is there not a realm of possibility where you could say, because gamers have advanced and learned the game, that they would also be able to advance and learn the faster pace of 7v7 because they have all this previous knowledge. Now, obviously you could say, well, then Flats, it's not as relevant to new players. We are in the 5v5 format, which is currently, in my opinion, the best for new players, and they still don't want to play. That being said, if we're already not getting that many new players, wouldn't you want to keep all of your old players and enable those players more than anything? That's where I come in on the 7v7. I think that the engine can't handle it, though. I don't think console could even play it, right? But like, that doesn't mean I shouldn't at least talk about it as a potential option, right? Because if we spend the next 2 years reverting to 6v6, and then we roadblock into the same problems and the game sucks again, dude, we're going in f***ing circles. My idea was to at least put the idea out into the open. Let's speak it into the universe as a potential option right now. Because right now, we are going to eventually test 6v6, right? Season 13. And they're gonna see if they like it or not, and if they do like it, then, you know, maybe they end up deciding to go that route, whatever. At least it gives them a few years of runway time to experiment and see if it's even possible, right? Because let's say we go through the whole 6v6 cycle in 2 years and then want to talk about 7v7, it's gonna be years until then, right? Like in some hypothetical world where it ends up being the correct answer, which I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying like a hypothetical, you would be putting that timeline years behind. So by doing it now, where we're already open about talking about formats, at least test it, give it a shot. Because they can test it, we can't. We legitimately can't, because you can only have 6 players on a team in the current engine. We, as players, can't even test it. Me speaking into the universe is just kind of like a, hey guys, here's a freebie. Remember we were talking about the jobs thing earlier and how like, you know, like the core gameplay designer job listing, whatever. This is me giving you my free consulting. You know, give it a shot, see what happens. And so that's why I become that's why I pitched the idea of 7v7. That's why I talked about the idea of 7v7. Because I don't think 6v6 is going to end up being the answer. I think gameplay-wise, it'll feel a lot better. I think I personally would benefit a lot being a tank player. At least at this point, while they're kind of considering doing other options, giving something new and something fresh might be a different perspective that's needed, because especially if you've ever worked on a team of people before, sometimes teams don't even think about that kind of stuff and experience something called groupthink, which is basically a group of people, if they work together long enough, will all start to kind of think the same way. And that gets really, really dangerous because you won't think of things that are outside the box, or even if you do, you won't speak on them because you don't want to disrupt the norm, right? So I know it's a little bit crazy. I know it's a little bit out there. Trust me, I'm very well aware. I'm not stupid. I wanted to both reduce the amount of pressure that's on the individual tank player, bring back synergy to a lot of those characters that don't currently work, while also trying to reduce the problem of 6v6, which is queue times, right? So I wanted to try to give both what they need, and I don't think anything outside of 7v7 would work. And the problem is, though, is like people run with it. They're like, well, why don't we just make it 50v50? Okay, why don't we just make it 1v1? Now you don't have to worry about either of it. It's like, why do you jump to the extreme, dude? Sit and think for a second, you know? People are way too quick to jump to an assumption on something that they've literally never tried and might not work or might work. So it's like, no good idea comes in overnight, right? Like it takes time, you know? And sometimes even the people who think they're the smartest in the world and know shit end up missing some of the best opportunities because they turn their nose up at it and go, nah, it's not, that ain't it. That ain't it. And I've experienced that myself. I did that with Fortnite before I was a streamer. One of my friend's cousins told me I should get into this game called Fortnite. I was like, nah, that game's not gonna go anywhere. It's not cool. This was like literally when it like came out and first started. Blew up to be the biggest game in the world. I was dead wrong. Imagine if I became a Fortnite streamer. Dude, I would have been a millionaire. Probably not, but like, you get what I'm saying, right? That's pretty much my reasoning for the 7v7 stuff. I know there's a lot more stuff to talk about on that point, like balancing and, you know, maps and all that stuff, but like, first let's go if it's even feasibly possible. You know? Anyways, that's my 7v7. Since you were so curious, figured I'd give you a little snippet.